In the immortal words of Chesty Puller at Chosin, he was asked by a reporter, what is the situation? We have Chinese in front of us. We have Chinese behind us. We have Chinese to the left. We have Chinese to the right. By God, they won't get away this time. Col Tom Abel will present our program on the Korean War. Thank you.
Test. Well, I guess it would be very appropriate to say in Korean, thank you. Kamsahamnida. Thank you for the introduction there, Jim. We appreciate it. Now, I'll start out, every good lecture, I'm told, starts out with a joke. And that's why I don't have one. Now, seriously, I think every good presentation starts out with a quiz. And so I've got a couple questions here for the audience. The first question is, can anybody name the most watched video in the world in existence? Say again there, sir. Gangnam Style. You've got it. Exactly right. Can anybody name the second part of this quiz? The second amphibious assault the Marine Corps did in the Korean War. Mike. The Han River. Right on the money, Mike. Now, for bonus points, can anybody link the most watched video in the world to the Gangnam Style, to the assault across the Han River? Fire away, USAA. You're exactly right. Gangnam is the south side of the Han River. And in fact, we're going to show a little bit about this video right here. And this is the south side of the Han River. This is Gangnam right here. South side of the Han River. And this is where Chesty Puller stood. And he looked north, looking out towards you right here at the city of Seoul. Now we're going to go ahead and roll the video here. And we're going to see if we can find any other sites relevant to Chesty Puller and Mike Cavanaugh's assault across the Han River. Ed? Okay, right here. Here. Eyes on the target. Keep your eyes on the target, please. Now, right here you'll see another view of the Han River. This is from Gangnam once again, looking from the south to the north into downtown Seoul. Here's the river right here that Puller and the Marines, Mike Cavanaugh included, would have assaulted across to get into the city for what's called, the Marine Corps called the Battle of the Barricades, the Battle of Seoul itself. So let's go ahead and continue. Okay, we've made it. We've made it to the objective area. Okay. Another good shot of the Han River. You're looking from the south, the Gangnam, to the north, into downtown Seoul. Mike, I don't think that bridge was standing in September 1950, was it? Under the water bridge. Now, take a look at these craft right here. Anybody know the name of these amphibious craft? That would be a course called the duck. Do you think Marines use ducks when they cross the Han River? Well, let's go ahead and find out. Okay, we'll start out with our presentation. Okay, and before I kick it off, I'll lay out some rules of engagement. Of course, many of you have had rules of engagement out in the combat zones, out in the wars. ROE for this particular engagement is pretty simple. I'll go through some slides to talk about the history of the Korean War. If you were there, chime in. We'd love to make the connection at that point. If you'd like something to say, stand up and say it. If it draws into a lengthy sea story, save it to the end. There's plenty of time at the end I've allowed for questions, comments, and of course the social part afterwards. So with that said, let's go ahead and talk about what happened 63 years ago this year. Of course, 63 years ago was the start of the Korean War. And I submit to you, if it wasn't for the Korean veterans in this room, along with their brothers and sisters in arms, that entire peninsula would be black today. So let's take a look at what this geography is. This is a satellite shot of light from space, taken from space obviously, of electrical lighting in the Sea of Japan area. Now you can see the Japanese peninsula here, you can see Jeju-do Island here, Straits of Tsushima here, Yellow Sea here, Sea of Japan here, South Korea, Seoul here, Pyongyang here in North Korea, and all of China. Now I use this to make a literal and a figurative connection here. If it hadn't been for you who went out to that war, I'll tell you, that peninsula would be dark in itself, literally and figuratively. But fortunately, half that peninsula is a bright spot within our environment today, within our world, and contributing. In fact, let's see how South Korea contributes today. South Korea is the 7th largest trading partner of the United States. It's the host of 28,000 United States personnel. Now, that's a significant item, not just for protection of the Korean Peninsula, but they bring a strategic stability to the region in that area. Gee, North Korea has an atomic bomb, don't they? You'd think that maybe one of their neighbors would want an atomic weapon, wouldn't they? Well, there's some U.S. forces in that area, and we've got a pact to protect people in that area. So just having the U.S. forces up in the Korean Peninsula provide a regional stability that's very important. A Korean citizen is the head of the United Nations at this time. And Korea has contributed to to the Iraq and the Afghanistan campaigns. But of course, perhaps they're best known for the Gangnam Style video. Okay, and so here is Chesty Puller. He's overlooking Seoul in September 1950. I think Mike Cavanaugh was right over here when the picture was taken. Right where that Han River photo was taken for Gangnam Style. And here's our participants. The United Nations, with the largest supporter, the United States, South Korea, North Korean flag, and of course the Chinese step in fall of 1950. So we'll talk a little bit about the Marine support during the Korean War. And to link that amphibious assault, that second amphibious assault, to this presentation, there they are, going into the Han River. Right there. And, as a matter of fact, here are the tracks themselves crossing the Han just north of Seoul, which is a little bit wider. Okay, now you've all been through boot camp or officer candidate school, and there's some armored recognition that goes on. You know what you've had to identify: tanks, vehicles, aircraft, whatever that might be. So can anybody chime in and tell me what type of armored vehicle this is? A duck. Let's take a look at that. Next slide. You got it. It's a duck. In fact, I do believe that's the same duck right there. Mike is probably going to have a funner ride on that duck than he did on his previous duck. Okay, next slide. All right, let's talk a bit about the background, then I'm going to return to the Inchon invasion, and we're going to make our way through the Korean War. All right, background. Did you know that Japan occupied Korea from 1904 to 1945? And then in 1945, after World War II ended, the Soviet Union and the United States essentially drew a line down the middle of that Korean peninsula and split it at the 38th parallel. Kim Il-sung was set up as the ruler of the North. In fact, his grandson is the ruler of Korea today. Soviets imposed a communist government. The United States supported a capitalist government led by Syngman Rhee, of course, located in Seoul right here. Next slide. Well, in January 1950, Uncle Joe Stalin right here, gave Kim Il-sung the green light to go ahead and reunite that peninsula. That led to a status of war. And that kicked off as follows. June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded the South. By the evening of June 28th, the South Korean capital of Seoul was captured. In fact, what was North Korea's secret weapon? Not so secret. Can anybody identify that? T-34. You got it, Mike. Anybody ever seen a T-34? Yep, they're out there. 100 of these T-34s punched south in a blitzkrieg-style tactic, and the South Korean anti-armor weapon didn't exist. So it's kind of a famous story in Seoul today that the South Koreans used to stop those tanks. College students strapped themselves with explosives, ran to the T-34 tanks, and blew them up as they could. But they couldn't take them all out, and the tanks kept on going south. And as they proceeded south, it looked like the entire peninsula would stall. However, Douglas MacArthur, of course in charge of UN forces in Japan, teamed up with the United Nations forces from 21 other nations and came out of Japan to go ahead and stunt that North Korean advance. But the army of Japan is what? Fat. They haven't done anything for 5 years. And I'm going to peel back the army in Japan here because it's a real interesting story here. What happens to, next slide, Task Force Smith. Okay, Task Force Smith is the first Army battalion that was engaged in the Korean Peninsula War in 1950. Essentially, they were taken out of Japan, put on boats, and dumped right here in Pusan. They said, go forth until you can kick the North Koreans in the ass. And here's where they ended up, right here in Osan, Korea. Has anybody been to Osan? Sure. Look at all the hands around here. Osan is a U-2 base where we fly the spy plane. It's called the TR-1 out of it. An A-10 base. It's a large U.S. base. Well, right there in Osan, Korea is where Task Force Smith met their fate. And here's Task Force Smith landing at Pusan. Next slide. And here is Task Force Smith starting the initial engagements of the Korean forces of the Korean War, right outside of Osan. What do you think he's aiming that bazooka at? T-34 that came through there in that armored blitzkrieg. All right, and take a look at this. This gentleman on the right, a few minutes after this photo's taken, he's the first United States KIA in Korea, right there. Now, a little bit of trivia. There was a U.S. force in Korea called JUSMEG, Joint U.S. Military Advisor Group Korea, in 1950. Lo and behold, Seoul was going to fall in June. Where'd they go? They got on a fertilizer freighter out of the port of Inchon and sailed themselves out of there with their families. Did a NEO in 1950. So they got out of there, and the first combat forces were right there, Task Force Smith. Today, the Army, a common saying, I've worked with the Army many times, is no more Task Force Smith. They came out of there fat, and nobody's going to ask you if you're ready for war when you go to war. They're going to send you there. And Task Force Smith and the Army learned that lesson well. Well, somebody had to come help them out, and who do you think that would be? 1st Marine Provisional Brigade right there. And there they are in San Diego getting ready to ship out. I'm curious, is anybody in this photo by chance? Okay. Mike, perhaps? And there they go. And, in fact, here they are. We just saw them leave San Diego, and guess where they're landing right there? Pusan, Korea. Okay? This is the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade that went into Pusan. Didn't do the Inchon invasion yet, but went into Pusan to help out the Army. And, in fact, the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade was later disbanded, reinstated, disbanded, reinstated, and it was last used in Iraq. And on the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade colors are these two banners right here that it earned at this particular fight. Now, a little bit of infantry and aviation history here. Who was engaged first? The infantry, Marine infantry, or Marine aviation in the Korean War? Is that a trick question? It is not a trick question. Aviation from a Korean vet. From a Crown. All right, give me a hand if you think the grunts were engaged first. Who thinks the grunts? Who thinks aviation? Huh. All right, next slide. Here's when the infantry was engaged, 2nd of August. Next slide. Look at that. 24 hours in advance, they had the aviation beat. These Corsairs flying for VMA 214, the Black Sheep, Pappy Boynton's own squadron. Anybody know what they're flying today? Harriers, you got it, Navy 8B Harrier.